Just weeks before her passing, Queen Elizabeth summoned Catherine to a secluded garden at Windsor. What she revealed about Charlotte left Catherine stunned and changed everything. It was an afternoon steeped in silence, the kind of silence that speaks volumes. No guards, no staff, no note left behind for Charles or Camilla. Just a quiet request, hand-delivered to Catherine's chambers by the Queen's most trusted footman, marked only with the words, "Walk with me." What unfolded in the Queen's private rose garden was more than a conversation. It was a passing of power that defied protocol and rewrote the rules of legacy. Elizabeth, nearing the twilight of her reign, had grown contemplative. The crown weighed heavier than ever, not because of age or duty but because of what loomed ahead. The monarchy she spent her life preserving now stood on a knife's edge between tradition and transformation. In Charlotte, Elizabeth had seen something she had not anticipated: poise without pretense, intuition without arrogance, and a fire that reminded her of a very different Windsor bloodline, Diana's. Over countless small observations, gestures, and moments, the Queen's conviction grew. Charlotte was not merely born into royalty, she carried it. And that realization was not shared with Charles, nor Camilla. In fact, Elizabeth had deliberately shielded this growing belief from those closest to the throne. She feared interference, distortion, even retaliation. So she chose Catherine, a woman she had once regarded with formal detachment but had come to deeply respect as the sole bearer of her most sacred, final wish. There, among the garden's oldest roses, many planted by Elizabeth's own hand decades prior, the Queen unveiled her decision. She had written a personal document, one never filed with the Crown Office, declaring her desire for Charlotte to inherit a special title, a legacy separate from the succession, yet just as powerful in its symbolism. A role that would echo Diana's compassion and Elizabeth's strength, embodying the monarchy's future rather than its past. Catherine, speechless at first, listened in disbelief. The Queen was resolute, her eyes unwavering. "It's not about bloodlines," she said. "It's about the soul fit to wear the crown of hearts." Then, with a final breath of resolve, she placed her hand gently over Catherine's and added, "Keep this close, and when the moment is right, let it be known." Catherine returned to Kensington that day with more than just memory. She carried a monarch's dying desire, scribbled in faded ink and sealed in silence. She hid it away, swearing to protect it until the world was ready. But that time came sooner than expected, and Catherine's decision to speak would ignite a royal firestorm no one was ready for. Buried in the Queen's private papers was an annotated decree, an unfiled royal wish that names Princess Charlotte as heir to a new royal legacy, one that bypasses Camilla altogether. It was during a quiet afternoon in Kensington Palace, weeks after the Queen's funeral, that Catherine stumbled upon the document that would change everything. In a room few were allowed to enter, one lined with keepsakes, locked drawers, and untouched mementos, Catherine discovered a sealed envelope nestled beneath a pile of the Queen's private stationery. The handwriting was unmistakable, slanted, precise, and aged. She opened it slowly, heart pounding, unsure of what the late monarch had left behind. What she found was not merely a note, it was a decree, in the Queen's own words, penned with clarity and intention. And it was addressed not to her son Charles, nor to the Crown Office, but to Catherine herself. It was a private legacy, carefully outlined, never meant for the bureaucracy of the throne. Within it, Queen Elizabeth named a ceremonial role for Charlotte, one that bypassed Camilla entirely and reached into the soul of the monarchy's emotional lineage. The Queen had envisioned something symbolic, a title rooted in tradition but reborn through grace. Catherine read the words again and again, as if making sense of a secret the world was never meant to know. The Queen had chosen to honor her granddaughter with a Scottish lineage, a title once whispered about but never assigned in modern times. It was not part of the formal line of succession. It was something far more sacred. The title, Guardian of Windsor's Grace. A name woven from centuries of royal valor and Elizabeth's own whispered fears that Camilla's growing influence might cloud the future of the House of Windsor. The Queen feared not Camilla's presence alone, but her power to overshadow the young generation, to rewrite the narrative with her own family's image. Elizabeth, in her final days, had been deliberate. The instructions were clear. The title was to be announced once Catherine became Queen Consort. But Catherine, burdened with the weight of the promise made in the garden, could not wait. She had seen the tides shifting. Camilla's reach is growing bolder. Decisions once made in hushed corners were now echoed in public forums. Catherine knew that every day of silence chipped away at the Queen's intent. So she made a choice that would not only honor Elizabeth's dying wish, but protect Charlotte's rightful place in the monarchy's emotional legacy. She whispered the title to her daughter one morning, gently, like passing down a hidden crown. Charlotte blinked, uncertain of what it meant, but Catherine knew that moment would live forever. And then, Catherine did what no one expected. She made the Queen's wish public, quietly at first, through select aides, but it spread quickly. And when it reached Camilla's ears, the reaction wasn't just disbelief, it was rage, and it would shake the palace walls. The cameras never saw it, but inside the gilded drawing room, Camilla exploded at Catherine in a tirade that left aides frozen. And it wasn't just about Charlotte. Catherine's decision to speak the Queen's wish aloud wasn't made lightly. It came during a royal foundation gathering, a closed-door event meant to discuss legacy initiatives for the next generation. She stood confidently among patrons and senior royals, choosing her words with care as she referenced a private message left by Her Majesty regarding the path ahead. Those in attendance understood immediately that something significant had shifted. But no one was prepared for the volcanic fury that erupted once the room emptied. Camilla approached like a storm-breaking protocol, her voice low at first, controlled, almost rehearsed. But then the dam cracked. "How dare you," she spat, "invoke the Queen to elevate your own daughter? You've crossed a line." The confrontation that followed was unlike anything the palace walls had witnessed in years. Catherine stood her ground, calm but unflinching, refusing to allow the Queen's handwritten note to be dismissed as opportunism. Camilla, however, couldn't contain the betrayal she felt. It wasn't just the shock, it was the humiliation. She had been caught off guard, made irrelevant in front of figures she once counted as allies. Her words turned bitter. "You're rewriting the monarchy to fit your daughter. You're hijacking the legacy for your own bloodline." The sting of that accusation lingered in the air. Catherine didn't respond. She didn't have to. Her silence, composed and unwavering, said more than any rebuttal ever could. Anne stood in the corner, a witness to the unraveling. She didn't intervene, nor did she defend Camilla. That silence spoke volumes, especially to Camilla, who had once believed Anne to be a quiet ally. The weight of that quiet rejection seemed to crush Camilla even more. And just when the air in the room seemed thick enough to drown in, William entered seconds too late. He saw Catherine's face, Camilla's fury, and Anne's haunted gaze, and knew something irreversible had just happened. He tried to speak, but there was nothing left to diffuse. The moment had detonated. The monarchy's inner sanctum had fractured in real time, and there was no repairing it with pleasantries or tradition. Camilla left in silence, retreating down the corridor with her fists clenched, but the damage was done. The fury she unleashed had not stopped Catherine. It had only confirmed the truth for everyone watching from the shadows. And while Camilla tried to contain the damage internally, the truth had already begun slipping into the hands of those who would weaponize it. An anonymous palace source leaked the Queen's letter, and overnight, the press ran wild with headlines that Camilla couldn't silence. It began with a single tabloid in the early hours of Monday morning. Within hours, it had exploded across every major front page. Queen names Charlotte as her chosen one. The Queen's private handwritten note, once protected under lock and key at Kensington, was now dissected by every anchor, columnist, and royal historian in the Western world. The language was clear, deliberate, and above all, personal. Elizabeth had not left behind a vague blessing. She had outlined a legacy, and she had named Charlotte. The implications were seismic. Suddenly, the monarchy's public image wasn't centered on Charles or Camilla, but a young girl who had yet to understand the weight she now carried in the court of public opinion. Camilla's press team reacted with the speed of panic. Statements were drafted within the hour, emphasizing that the Queen's note held no legal merit and that ceremonial titles were subject to royal discretion, not posthumous sentiment. But it was too late. The public had already chosen their side, and they chose with their hearts. The parallels to Princess Diana were impossible to ignore. The media, once obsessed with Camilla's rise, now turned their gaze to Charlotte, painting her as the modern embodiment of everything Diana once represented: grace, compassion, and unshakable poise beneath pressure. Headlines branded her the People's Princess too, and Camilla, already struggling to shake decades of controversy, found herself once again cast as the unwanted disruptor in a narrative she could no longer control. Catherine, meanwhile, remained silent. She refused interviews, declined to issue clarifying remarks, and made no appearance at the palace gates. Her silence became its own statement. It fueled speculation, inspired awe, and deepened the sense of mystery surrounding the Queen's final wish. Every day she remained quiet, the press grew louder. And in that void, royal experts took over the conversation. Analysts pored over the Queen's choice of words, noting the phrase, "protector of legacy," and its eerie similarity to titles once considered for Diana herself. Social media became a battlefield of nostalgia and prophecy, with millions rallying behind Charlotte's future. Then, as if fate were orchestrating the drama itself, an old BBC interview from Elizabeth resurfaced, one where the Queen, when asked about her great-grandchildren, paused and remarked, "There's something in Charlotte. A clarity, perhaps. A purpose I see even now." The interview had been dismissed at the time as grandmotherly affection, but now it landed with the weight of a royal premonition. Every moment from the past, every quote long forgotten, now aligned into a single, undeniable truth. The Queen had always seen something in Charlotte, and the world was just beginning to catch up. With the media swirling and Camilla isolated, one royal unexpectedly came to Catherine's defense, rekindling an old alliance the Queen herself once forged. In a rare public comment, Princess Anne stepped forward, and what she said stunned everyone, especially Camilla. Amid the chaos of headlines and the deepening divide behind palace gates, there was one voice the public had not yet heard, one that mattered more than anyone realized. Princess Anne had remained silent through much of the rising storm. Loyal to duty, bound by tradition, and famously reserved, Anne was never one to court media or fan speculation, but this time was different. The Queen's private wish had become public warfare. Camilla was weaponizing silence and scrambling to contain perception. Catherine had taken a principled stance and refused to comment. But it was Anne Elizabeth's only daughter, her confidant in moments no one else witnessed, who finally stepped forward. In a terse, unannounced press briefing outside the palace, Anne stood before reporters with neither ceremony nor pageantry. Her words were few, but their weight shook the institution. "The Queen made her peace," she said flatly, and it was her peace to make. She offered no further context, no elaboration, but in those 7 words, Anne had done more than acknowledge the note she had validated. It wasn't the endorsement Catherine's allies had hoped for, but it was far from neutral. It was Anne's way of drawing a line in the sand. Those close to the late Queen knew what Anne meant. They remembered Elizabeth's growing fondness for Charlotte not just as a child of the monarchy, but as a symbol of what it could become. Elizabeth often remarked in private, especially to Anne, that Charlotte had a fire in her eyes. It was a phrase Anne repeated now during closed meetings with senior aides, and it was more than a metaphor. It was a statement of alignment, of loyalty, not to Camilla's construct of the crown, but to the Queen's personal judgment. When Camilla heard the clip, she was livid. For years, she had believed Anne to be a quiet supporter, someone who, though occasionally cold, had never directly opposed her. But this felt like betrayal. Anne's refusal to side with Camilla, especially in this moment, carried implications far beyond personal allegiance. It undermined the narrative Camilla's team had tried so hard to construct, that the Queen's letter was an outdated, emotional note, that it lacked substance, that it was nothing more than sentimentality. Anne had shattered that illusion with a single phrase. Then, as if history itself were echoing approval, footage from 2017 resurfaced. A minor event at Balmoral, long forgotten. It showed Charlotte, barely 2 years old, being gently led by Anne through a quiet ceremonial moment. No media attention, no official statement, just a quiet, symbolic passing of something ancient. And now, in hindsight, it felt prophetic, as if Elizabeth had always known and had always included Anne in her quiet preparations. But Anne's subtle endorsement wasn't the only force building behind Catherine. Soon, Parliament would weigh in, and royal history would be rewritten. A closed-door royal summit was convened at Balmoral, and for the first time since the Queen's passing, the line of succession was quietly discussed and challenged. It was Charles who called for the summit. On the surface, it was an effort to restore calm, to mend the fractures that had split the monarchy since the Queen's private letter was leaked. But those who entered the ancestral halls of Balmoral knew this was no ordinary meeting. Behind the carefully worded invitations and the polite nods in corridors, there was a storm waiting to be unleashed. The real purpose of the gathering was to address the growing constitutional and emotional tremors caused by Elizabeth's final wish. And no matter how hard Charles tried to package it as a discussion, everyone knew it was a reckoning. Catherine came prepared. She carried the letter, the original, creased and fragile, but powerful enough to divide a monarchy. When she stood before the assembled royals and senior advisors, she didn't speak with aggression or defiance. She spoke with duty. She recited the Queen's words with unwavering calm, reminding those present that this was not about titles or protocol, it was about intent. It was about honoring the monarch whose shadow still loomed large over every gilded frame and velvet chair in that room. Her voice didn't tremble, but Camilla's fury echoed before Catherine had even finished. Seated to Charles's left, Camilla didn't bother to mask her disdain. She had already spent weeks undermining the letter's relevance in private conversations. But now, faced with Catherine's calm clarity and the unshakable presence of Anne nearby, her influence began to erode. Camilla fought to shift the narrative behind the scenes. She lobbied senior staffers, whispered reassurances to hesitant dukes, and demanded that the conversation return to protocol, not sentiment. But the tide was shifting. And then came the moment that would define the summit William stood on. For years, he had remained diplomatic, carefully threading the line between legacy and modernity. But now he chose. "We serve the legacy, not the crown," he said plainly, a single sentence that cleaved through centuries of silence. At that moment, William didn't just support his wife. He backed his mother's dying wish. He backed the Queen. And in doing so, he forced the entire room to reckon with a monarchy that could no longer hide behind structure alone. To the surprise of many, several parliamentarian voices present, invited discreetly by Charles for legal consultation, began to speak of alternatives. They suggested ceremonial titles could be split between royal branches, preserving the dignity of tradition while honoring the Queen's unique final act. It wasn't about the throne itself, it was about narrative, symbolism, the future. But when the idea of a compromise was raised, one that would officially name Charlotte as Guardian of Windsor's Grace in a joint proclamation, Camilla's silence spoke louder than protest. She would not accept it. Not publicly, not privately. She had been bypassed once in life. Now it was happening again, this time not by Diana, but by a child. The summit ended not with consensus, but with a fracture sealed in silence. Camilla rose, said nothing, and exited the room with a stare that chilled every soul who met it. Camilla left the summit in silence, but what she did next would ensure the war for Charlotte's legacy was far from over. In a desperate attempt to reclaim public favor, Camilla launched a royal initiative for her own grandchildren, only to be met with brutal public rejection. The summit at Balmoral had left Camilla bruised, not just in title but in pride. Her influence, once quietly expanding behind closed doors, had been stopped cold by the Queen's final letter and the tide of public support flowing toward Charlotte. But Camilla wasn't ready to surrender. In private meetings with her aides, she devised a counter-narrative plan to restore her stature and subtly reposition her own grandchildren within the royal sphere. It began with a proposal to grant them honorary roles within the royal family's charitable arms. Accompanying titles purely ceremonial, she insisted would be attached to their names, elevating them within public consciousness without directly invoking succession. But everyone at the palace knew what this really was: retaliation cloaked in legacy. Advisors warned her, they urged restraint, and begged her to consider the optics. With the Queen's letter still dominating headlines and the nation embracing Charlotte as the spiritual heir to Elizabeth's grace, any move to promote Camilla's family would be seen as a threat. But Camilla dismissed their concerns. She believed silence had cost her too much already, and now, action was her only weapon. The announcement came swiftly, buried in a palace press release, but it didn't go unnoticed. Within hours, the backlash erupted. Social media turned savage. "Stop trying to erase Charlotte," one headline screamed. Others accused Camilla of rewriting history in real time. The backlash wasn't polite, it was personal, furious, and unrelenting. And then came the moment that shattered whatever control Camilla thought she still had. Charlotte, unannounced and unexpectedly, appeared alongside Catherine at a public engagement meant to support children's health. It was a quiet event on the calendar, hardly newsworthy under ordinary circumstances, but the moment Charlotte stepped into view, the atmosphere shifted. The crowd rose, cheers erupted. The applause was deafening. It wasn't the presence of royalty, it was the affirmation of destiny. Cameras captured the faces in the crowd. Tears, awe, reverence. And in that moment, without saying a word, Charlotte became the embodiment of the monarchy's future. Behind palace walls, Camilla watched the footage play on repeat. Her fury was volcanic. Not at the public, not even at Catherine, but at Charles. His silence had become unbearable. He hadn't defended her. He hadn't stopped the leaks. And he hadn't stood against Anne, or William, or anyone else who had turned this tide. According to a palace insider, that night Camilla let loose in a private confrontation so fierce it left staff shaken. Her words were scathing. This was never the Queen's plan. She wanted unity, not this. But no one answered, not even Charles. Because deep down, they all knew it was the Queen's plan. Every line of ink on that letter had led to this. As Camilla's efforts unraveled, Catherine made one final move. One that cemented Charlotte's place in history and honored the Queen's last breath. In a quiet chapel, beneath a soft rain, Charlotte was bestowed with a new title, one the Queen had written in her own hand. And Camilla was nowhere to be found. There was no grandeur, no press, no fanfare, just a sacred moment witnessed by those who had carried the burden of legacy and loss. Tucked away in the Scottish Highlands, where Elizabeth herself had once sought refuge from the weight of the crown, a private ceremony unfolded. William and Catherine, determined to preserve the sanctity of the Queen's final wish, chose Balmoral not just for its solitude, but for its soul. The place meant everything to Elizabeth. And now, it would be where her last wish would live, not in politics or headlines, but in ritual. Anne, solemn and still, presided over the ceremony not as a princess, but as a sister honoring a mother's final decree. She read aloud Elizabeth's words from the letter. Let her inherit not just what glitters, but what endures. Then came the moment that history would remember, even if it was never televised. Charlotte, poised but quietly unsure, stood before her family as Anne proclaimed her the Princess of Balmoral Grace. A title not born from hierarchy but from legacy, one that tied her spirit to both Elizabeth's duty and Diana's empathy. For a moment, time seemed to pause. And then Catherine stepped forward, her voice trembling not with fear, but reverence. She was your queen, she said softly, but she was also your grandmother. And this was her final gift to you. Tears were held, not shed. It wasn't grief anymore, it was purpose. Catherine gently revealed a small velvet box containing a tiara never seen by the public. It had been set aside decades earlier, rumored to have belonged to the Queen's personal collection, untouched and unworn. The note inside, scrawled in Elizabeth's unmistakable script, read only, "For Charlotte, at the right time." That time had arrived. There was no crown, no throne, but there was power in presence and meaning in silence. Charlotte's response was quiet but definitive. She looked first to Anne, then to her mother, and whispered just 6 words. I will guard it. I will. It wasn't rehearsed. It wasn't even expected. But in those words, she accepted not just the title, but the burden, the weight of a grandmother's faith, the hope of a family fractured by years of bitterness, and the fragile promise of a monarchy reborn. Outside, the rain continued to fall gently, almost like a benediction from the heavens themselves. Inside, a new chapter had begun, not marked by coronation, but by commitment. Not by power, but by grace. And while the ceremony offered a moment of peace, the storm behind the palace walls had not yet passed. But just when peace seemed possible, a royal document resurfaced that would threaten to reopen every wound. Locked away in a secure vault was one final envelope from Queen Elizabeth, addressed only to the future queen, and it remains unopened to this day. It was an archivist's routine task, a quiet review of royal correspondence stored deep within the private vaults of Windsor. But what began as mere cataloging ended with the discovery of something far more extraordinary. A single cream-colored envelope, thick with age and sealed in the Queen's unmistakable red wax. There was no official stamp, no formal header, only one line of script across the front. To the future Queen. No name, no date, no instruction, just a haunting message frozen in time, echoing across generations. When the envelope was brought to the attention of the senior royal team, the air shifted. This was not a forgotten relic. It was a message waiting for the right moment and the right woman. The question reverberated instantly. Who was it for? Catherine? Charlotte? Or someone yet to rise? The ambiguity was deliberate. The Queen had always understood the power of timing, of language, of secrets held just beyond reach. She didn't need to clarify. She wanted it to linger just as her presence had. The decision fell to William. After weeks of hushed debate behind palace doors, he issued a statement so quiet and yet so commanding that it stopped speculation in its tracks. "It will be opened on Charlotte's 21st birthday," he said. Nothing more. No elaboration, no commentary. A single sentence that pulled the world into a future moment still to come. A countdown had begun not just to a birthday, but to a revelation. Across the globe, the media swarmed. Columnists, royal watchers, historians all debated the possibilities. What was inside? A personal blessing? A private warning? A final confession about succession? Was it meant to crown or caution? Theories spiraled in every direction, but one truth held firm. Whatever was in that envelope had been meant to echo through the very bones of the monarchy. Its silence was deafening. And while the press spun stories from fragments, Camilla watched quietly from Windsor. She issued no public statements. She gave no private comments. But those closest to her said she was changed, distant, guarded, almost defeated. Because the envelope was proof indisputable that Elizabeth had left one more word unspoken. And Camilla would never get to shape it. Now, the royal family waits, and so does the world. That sealed envelope has become more than parchment and wax. It's become a symbol, a reminder that the Queen's reign may have ended, but her voice has not. It still lingers, waiting to rise, waiting to crown. And somewhere between Balmoral's grace and Windsor's legacy stands a girl who carries it all, not through entitlement, but through quiet inheritance. A story not chosen, but entrusted. The monarchy has crowned many queens, but only a few were chosen in silence, in love, and in legacy. And now, one little girl carries it all while the crown itself waits to speak again. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in the next one.